All right, I'll get started now. Can people hear me? Okay. My name is, let me turn on my camera too. Hi, I'm at the office, so I have to wear a mask now. My name is Chris Vagos. I'm the refuge wildlife biologist at Stuart B. McKinney National Wildlife Refuge. And today, Adam Hammershoy, one of our Faulkner Island interns for this summer, is gonna give you a presentation. I'll let him introduce the presentation. So Adam, also let us know a little bit about your background, okay? Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adam. I'm one of the Faulkner Island interns working this summer. Faulkner Island is located off the shore of Guilford Island. You might have seen it before because it does have a lighthouse. So it's a pretty recognizable island off the coast. So during the summer, what I've been focusing on is looking at the common and roseate terns that are found on that island. And Faulkner Island has one of the largest colonies for the common tern in the entire country. And the roseate terns are considered endangered. And so what we've been focusing on is making sure that there is a count of eggs that are found on the island. So one of our main jobs is to walk around the island and look for eggs that are found throughout the island. This is for the common terns and also the roseate terns. The roseate tern eggs are a little bit harder to find because they're usually found in between rocks. So you do have to do a little bit of searching throughout the island to find those eggs. We also walk around the island and make sure there are no predators on the island. And I'll go more in detail about what this means throughout the presentation. And then we also do some work around the island for maintenance, such as keeping the island intact. And we also do some work back at the refuge as well, which is located in Westbrook. So my internship is coming towards an end. It's ending next week. And so we've had to put together this presentation to kind of introduce some of the work that we've been doing, and then also a main topic that's going on. And this main topic that I'm focusing on are the many threats that seabirds focus on a global scale. So I'll mostly be focusing on a global scale, but I will also be focusing on the seabirds within Connecticut as well. So during my presentation, I'm going to be asking some questions. If you happen to know the answer, I believe how it works is that you can raise your hand to answer a question. If you feel like you know the answer, I will call on you and you can answer my question. And it's okay if you don't know the answer. If you don't know the answer, then I will just give it away and let you know and give you some extra information about that topic. So just to get started, I'll open up my first slide. So my first slide is going to be all the different kinds of seabirds that are found around the world. So I asked this as a question, does anyone know what a seabird is? So does anybody know what a seabird is? Let's see. I do not see any hands being raised. So if you feel like you know what a seabird is, you can unmute yourself and you can answer the question.
Is it a bird that lives at the sea? I'm not sure if they nest at the sea.
Yes, so these birds spend the majority of their time out at sea. So a seabird is a bird that's adapted to life within the marine environment. So here's an example of a seabird that we see throughout the globe. And this one is actually found here in Connecticut. This one is called the common tern. And so there are many different characteristics and traits that go into these types of birds. I will be going more in detail about these characteristics, just to kind of go over the few that we have, which are plumage coloration, the types of feathers that they have, the specific type of feet they have, the shape of their wings, salt glands, which I will explain more in detail when we get to that slide, the shape of their head, their diet, their flight patterns, their breeding, and their lifespan. So like I said, I will go more detail from each of these and individual slides. So just hold up and we'll get into those more in detail. So the first one we're going to talk about is the wings of a seabird. The wings of a seabird are actually very unique compared to other types of birds. So the wings of a seabird are long and slim in comparison to their small body, which helps in long distance traveling. So even though this type of bird may be very small, their wings are a lot larger than their bodies are, so it allows them to travel long distances despite their small size. So again, here I pulled up a common tern, and if you could see my mouse, I'm going to move my mouse around where their wings are. And as you can see, their bodies are relatively small, but their wings are much longer than their body length is. This allows them to fly long distances despite being a small size. And not only does their wing length have a factor in their traveling, but the feathers are also relatively waterproof too. These types of birds like to dive into water to collect their prey. So once they go underwater and they want to come back onto the mainland or back into the air, they won't be covered in water, and allow them to get that water off their wings relatively quickly so they can take flight again at ease. Next, we're going to talk about the salt glands of a seabird. These are actually a really interesting characteristic of these types of birds. So seabirds contain a salt removal system, which separates the excess salt from prey and drinking water. So just like any other organism, they can't really consume too much salt from either water or prey. So what they have in their body is a type of device or a removal system that takes out that salt from the prey and the drinking water. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up an image of a dissection of a seabird. So if you feel like you may not want to look at this image, you can turn away now. But if not, I'm going to pull up that image now. So here I have an image of a salt gland. I will zoom in a little more on that. But as you can see, what this scalpel is pointing towards is the salt gland, which is found inside the bird. So I put a red box around it so you can easily tell which part is the salt gland. So they're located inside the bird and allows the bird to get rid of that excess water from the prey and the drinking water. Next, we're going to talk about the webbed feet of a seabird. So the webbed feet allow seabirds to swim at high speeds and act as propellers when taking flight. So this is going to allow those seabirds to dive deep into the water to collect their prey and then immediately be able to take flight once they've escaped from the water. So here I pulled up an example of the brown pelican, and here's what their feet look like. As you can see, between each finger, as I would call it, we can see that there's skin between each one, and that allows them to propel themselves through the air and also through the water. All other types of seabirds have this characteristic, but I pulled up an example of a brown pelican so you can get a better idea on what this looks like. Next, we're going to talk about the bills of a seabird. Most of them are very similar to each other. However, there is actually one type of bird that has a different type of bill compared to the others. So most bills of a seabird have an aerodynamic shape, which means it allows them to approach the water and also the air at high speeds without having much impact from the water or the air. So here's an example of a great black-backed gull that I picked up on. As you can see, the bill is relatively skinny and also aerodynamic, meaning it's skinny on both sides, allowing the air and the water to be able to quickly pass through the sides of that bill. However, there is actually another type of bird that has a slightly different shape bill, and that is, for example, a puffin. A puffin has a rigid bill, which helps it catch more prey than other types of seabirds. So here's an example of an Atlantic puffin. As you can see, its bill is very much larger than the bill of a great black-backed gull. This Atlantic puffin can catch a lot more fish at one time compared to other types of seabirds. So most seabirds have the bill similar to that of the gull, but there are other seabirds similar to the puffin that have that type of bill as well. All right, so my next slide, I'm going to be asking some questions. If you happen to know what that seabird is, you can open up your microphone and you can answer that question. If you don't get it entirely correct, that's totally fine. If you don't know what it is, I'll wait a few seconds for anybody to answer. If I don't get an answer, then I will pull up what that type of bird is. Okay, so kind of gave it away from the last one, but does anybody know what this type of bird is?
Puffin.
Yes, it is a puffin. And just like the last slide that I pulled up, this one is called an Atlantic puffin. As you can see, the Atlantic puffin is found in New England, United States, Newfoundland, the coast of South France, Iceland, Greenland, and also in North Russia. All right, so I'm going to pull up the next bird and let's see if anybody knows what that one is. Does anybody know what this type of bird is? Kind of confusing, maybe not super familiar. All right, so I didn't get an answer for this one. So for this one this is called a short-tailed albatross. And those are found in the North Pacific Ocean and also in the Bering Sea. All right, the next type of bird that we have is this one. We might have seen this already in the previous slides. Does anyone remember what this one is called?
Go for common tern.
Yes, this is a common tern. Just like how we saw in the previous slides, this is the common tern, and those are found in all throughout North America, Europe, and Asia. All right, the next type of bird we're going to pull up is this one. Might have seen this before in some movies or on TV, but the head of it is very similar to something you might have seen before.
Brown pelican.
Yes, this is a brown pelican. So the brown pelican is found within the Virgin Islands and can also be found in Puerto Rico. All right, so the next type of seabird we have is this one. Might have seen this already in a previous picture. Does anyone remember what this one is called?
That's the blackback gull.
Yes, we have very
A
close.
herring gull. Herring gull. Okay.
Yep, very close. It looks very similar to the one we saw in the previous slide where it looked very similar to the black-backed gull. However, this one is called the American herring gull. As you can see, the beak of this one is relatively similar to the other type of gull that we saw as well. All right, and then finally, the last one, which looks very similar to one of the birds that we see in this presentation. However, its beak is very different shaped than the other ones are. Does anybody know what this one is?
Some
Black
kind of,
skimmer.
oh, sorry.
Black skimmer.
Yes, a black skimmer. Seems like you really know your birds. So here we have the black skimmer. And the black skimmer is found in Florida, California, the Caribbean, and the subtropical Pacific.
And in Connecticut.
Yes, and in Connecticut. All right, so moving on to the next slide. Any questions for this one? All right, moving on. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the life cycle of one of these birds, and that one is going to be the common tern. So we're going to follow through the life cycle of this type of bird to see what it does throughout its lifetime. All right, so the very first thing we're going to start off with is the adults migrate to New England and find a colony and a mate. And this occurs between April and May. Next, once they find their colony and a mate, the male selects a breeding territory and they protect it. Once that happens, the male courts the female by bringing her fish. And while I'm working on Falkner Islands, this is something very interesting to watch. We get to see the male holding a fish in its mouth and walking around the female trying to impress her by showing her the fish that he wants to bring her. Next, the female lays between 1 and 4 eggs, and this occurs between May and July. Next, the female and the male incubates the eggs for 20 to 26 days, and this involves the male or the female sitting on top of the egg and keeping the egg warm to allow the egg to incubate and to eventually to hatch. And the way how we can tell this is happening on the island is while we walk around the islands, we set the eggs upright. And the next time we go out to the island, if the egg is laying on its side, that's how we can tell that the egg has been incubated because the female or the male has laid on the egg, pushing it back down onto its side. So that's how we can measure whether or not the egg or eggs have been incubated. Next, the parents care for the chicks and protect against the predators. So I'll go more in detail later on talking about the predators that are found on Faulkner Island, but also throughout rest of the world, the parents would protect the chicks from the predators found in that specific habitat. Next, the chicks fledge when they are about 27 to 30 days old. Finally, the chicks migrate to the southern hemisphere between October and March. So our internship lasts between May and August, because after August is when the terns get ready to migrate down to the southern hemisphere. So they won't be at Faulkner Island for the rest of the year until they come back in April. The terns mate when they're about 3 years old, and that restarts the life cycle of the common tern. Any questions about the life cycle?
When the male courts the female by bringing her fish, does she always accept it, or does the female sometimes turn away the male?
That's something always funny to watch too. So when we're sitting on the dock and we're looking at the birds, you can see the female standing there while the male is walking around the female with the fish, and sometimes the female just kind of stares at him and nothing really happens. So not every single male will be able to impress every single female. So that's something that we get to see all the time, and we get to see whether it works or if it doesn't work.
Sorry, does the male have certain plumage that attracts the female? Do they look different that?
So they do have a little bit of different plumage. However, most of the time they're trying to impress the female with just the fish, and that will attract the female, and eventually that'll lead to the male and the female to mate, and eventually lead to incubation.
Interesting, thank you.
So again, another photo of a common tern. All right, so here I just have a why are seabirds important around the globe? So here I have these arrows. I have a drawing that I put together, and what we're going to do is we're going to follow through these arrows about what happens with a seabird, the water, and the mainland that the seabird is associated with. So why are seabirds important around the globe? So not just important to themselves, but they also bring important nutrients to islands. So for example, with Faulkner Island, the seabirds, such as the common and the Erosion terns, they bring important nutrients to that island. So in order to get those nutrients, the seabirds feed on the fish from the water, and they collect the nutrients from that fish and then also from the water. They contribute to the habitat for other species. So not just from themselves, but they also contribute to the other species that are found on that island. So what they do is they deposit the nutrients to the land by their droppings, and these nutrients are used by the plants that are found on the island. The rain then dissolves the nutrients that leak into the ocean, and then finally supports the phytoplankton growth. So it creates this cycle between the island, the water, the seabirds, and then also the plants that are found on the island. So it creates this cycle, so it keeps going throughout between these different habitats and keeps repeating itself to then bring nutrients to all the different organisms that are associated with this cycle. Does anybody have any questions about this? All right, finally, they are considered bioindicators for the environment. Has anybody ever heard of this term bioindicator? And if not, can anybody think about what this term means if we were to separate the word bio and indicator? All right, so what a bioindicator is. So seabirds are considered bioindicators because they can be used as a way to identify how healthy the environment is. So if this cycle is moving through effectively, we can make the assumption that the environment, whether it's we're talking about specifically the plants, the fish, the phytoplankton, if they are all doing healthy, then we can assume that the environment is also healthy. That's why these birds can be used as a way to identify whether or not the environment around them is considered healthy. All right, so what the big topic was for this presentation? What are the threats to these seabirds? There are many threats to these seabirds. So first off, we're going to talk about what are the threats to the seabirds globally. And then once we talk about what the threats are globally, then we'll get more in detail about the threats to the seabirds found in Connecticut. So the first threat that we're going to talk about are invasive species. So here's an example of an invasive species on Hawaii, and that's the Kalili ginger. This is considered an invasive plant species, which can create a negative effect on the habitat for the seabirds. Next, we have predators. So here's an example of a predator for specifically the common tern on Faulkner Island. So the black-crowned night heron feeds on these birds and can also create an effect on the environment around them. Next, we also have climate change. So here's an example of melting ice in Russia. As we can see, the ice is melting around the water, thus increasing the height of the water around it. And then finally, one we've heard about many times, which is human disturbance. And here I pulled up an example of pelicans covered in oil on the Grand Island in Louisiana. And so there are other examples of human disturbance, not just oil spills, but we also have pollution, overfishing, bycatch, and finally habitat destruction. So we will go more in detail as we pass through these. So moving on, we also have contaminants found in seabird prey. So some examples of contaminants are metals and pesticides. Pesticides such as example as DDT, even though DDT has been banned, we are still seeing it in the prey of these seabirds. So it's a good example of how even though we got rid of it, it's still found in the prey of these seabirds. So here's an example of what a heavy metal contaminant looks like. I'm going to give some examples of heavy metals that we can find in the environment. So some examples we can find are aluminum, manganese, iron, cobalt, and finally copper. So what do these contaminants do to the seabirds? They can cause a reduction in the eggshell thickness, the egg production, aberrant incubation behavior, delayed ovulation, and mortality of the chicks and also the adults. All right, so we talked about the seabirds that are found around the globe, but now specifically, we're going to talk about the seabirds that are found in our home, which is Connecticut. So here's our first bird. Does anybody know what this is?
Northern gannet.
Yes. So the first one we have, which is a northern gannet. Next one we did see this as an example earlier in the presentation. How about this one?
That's my black-backed gull.
Yes. We also have the great back black gull, just like we saw earlier in the presentation. We also have this bird. So this bird is called the American herring gull, which we saw earlier in the presentation. We saw this early in the presentation, so we saw this a few more times. And here we have the common tern. And then lastly, we have one that looks very similar to this, but there's a slight difference between these two birds. So this one, the one before was called the common tern. Does anyone know what this type of one is called?
Least turn.
Not the least tern, very close though. This one is called the roseate tern.
Roseate turn. Okay.
As you can see between the difference
Yep.
between these two birds is the roseate tern has a much darker bill than the common tern does. And it's kind of hard to tell between these two pictures, but the roseate tern typically has a longer wing than the common tern does. So it's kind of hard to tell between these two. And they also have a longer tail as well. All right, so we talked about what the seabirds do for the environment around the globe. But what do these seabirds do for us and the environment here in Connecticut? So just like we saw before, they bring nutrients to the islands, such as Faulkner Island. They contribute to the habitat for other species, such as other birds, and then also for the vegetation that's found on the islands. And also, just like we saw before, they are good indicators for climate change and how the humans are affecting the earth. So we can see that often on Faulkner Island, how these birds are showing how the humans are affecting that specific island and also the environment around it. So what are the threats to Connecticut seabirds? We talked about the threats to the seabirds throughout the globe, but what are the specific threats to the birds found here in Connecticut? So the first one we have, which is climate change. Then we have human disturbance, such as overfishing, pollution, and also invasive species, not just plants, but also other animals as well. So here we have an example of fishing pollution. As we can see that a fishing hook that was not disposed of properly can get caught inside of a seabird, which could then affect their population size because it could then harm or potentially even kill the seabird that goes diving down into the water. Next, we also have predation. And the predation can occur from numerous amounts of birds and also other land animals as well. But on Faulkner Island, it's mostly just flying animals, such as just birds. So here's an example of one type of predator. I will go in more detail of other types of birds, but here we have the peregrine falcon. So let's take a look at the threats to terns on specifically Faulkner Island, the island that I've been focusing on this entire summer. So the first one we have, which is predation. So the predators on Faulkner Island are the peregrine falcon, the black-crowned night heron, and also the American/fish crow. So first off, we have the peregrine falcon, and here's an image of a peregrine falcon sitting pretty high up. And so on the island, the peregrine falcon likes to sit on top of the lighthouse so we can get a full view of the entire island to spot its prey. Next, we have the black-crowned night heron. The black-crowned night heron likes to hunt during the night, and can also be a major predator for these birds as well. And then finally, we have the American crow, and then we also have the fish crow. And so these also like to target the birds as well. So these are the main types of predators that we found on the island. Second type of threat, we have pollution. So some pollution involves balloons and then also trash that can be found throughout the island and can harm the birds. So we often see balloons on the island towards the end of the school year. The reason why this happens is because while there are graduation parties happening, people like to then cut the strings off their balloons and let them be released into the air. And this eventually leads to these balloons landing on the islands. And so while we're on the island, not only do we look for the eggs and the birds, but we also have to look for balloons. And when we find a balloon, we then have to then pop it and then remove all of the string. The string can get wrapped around the birds and thus either harm it or even kill the bird. So when that graduation time comes around, please make sure to not allow those balloons to just go into the air because it can harm other animals. So here's what it looks like when we find it on the island. So we find balloons kind of hidden into the environment. And so we have to then find these balloons and get rid of them. So just like I talked about before, here it is in writing. I'm just talking about what happens when the balloon lands on the island. Does anybody have any questions about the pollution? All right, moving on. So just like I pulled up before, as we can see, the fishing pollution can also be a major factor in harming these birds. Next, we have invasive species. So invasive plants such as the Phragmites, the tree of heaven, the black swallowwort, the wild mustard, the bitterdock, and the mugwort pose a threat to nesting terns. So while we're on the island, we also have to remove Phragmites and also the other types of invasive plants on the island. So as you can see, the Phragmites really stick out compared to the rest of the island. So we have to go to these invasive plants and rip them out from the roots to remove them from the island. We have to do this constantly because they can always keep coming back. And so these invasive species can pose a major threat to the other plants on the island, which could then harm the common and the rosea terns on the island. Any questions about the invasive species on the island?
How does it pose? How do these plants pose the threat to the birds?
So that these plants can then take over the environment of the island, which could then harm the entire habitat of the entire island. So the birds like to then lay their eggs in tall grass, protect them from the predators. But if these plants take over the environment, it makes it really hard for the birds to be able to hide their eggs in the environment.
Thank you. I see. Thank you.
Hi, Adam. This is Chris. I'm just going to pipe in here. So the common tern really likes open habitat, and some of these species take over the shelves, like Phragmites. We have that on one of our most popular shelves in the southwest of the island. And now it's almost dominated by Phragmites. And so the terns don't really like really dense vegetation on Faulkner Island. In some other colonies, it's different, but they can't fly in and out of their nest as well, and they get caught. So swallowwort and some of the other invasives are vines, and they tend to catch the bird's wings as they're flying in and out of their nests. So it can also, we've actually found dead birds in some of the invasive species because they've been caught on the island trying to get back to their nests.
All right, so not only do we have those other threats, but we also have erosion on the island. And so the erosion is a good example of climate change. So the land is slowly eroding away, making it more difficult for the terns to nest on the island. So while we're on the island, we also see this all the time, especially on one specific side of the island. So here we can see the erosion on Faulkner Island. And so here we can see the dirt is being more exposed on the island, which is taking away from the habitat for these birds being able to nest. So it's taking away that ability for these birds to nest on the island. It's running out of space. So the east side of the island receives the most exposure from the wind, storm activity, and high tides, which is what's causing the most of the erosion on the island. Next, we also have human disturbance. So people often see Faulkner Island when they're out boating and think it'd be a cool place to dock, even though it's closed to visitors. They also sometimes let their pets loose on the island, and these pets may step on the nests or even take adult birds. So Faulkner Island is a no landing area most of the year. Every so often, there might be some type of event that might allow people to come visit the island, but for the majority of the time of the year, Faulkner Island is off limits. So when you approach the island, you can see that there's a sign that says no landing. So not only does that mean you can't dock your boat, but when you approach the dock, you can't even bring your boat between the jetty and the dock. So even though you may not have docked your boat, you still can't bring your boat inside of the island. And as you approach the island, there's another sign even closer to you so that you can see where it says no landing. So if you can, please try to avoid coming close into the island. It can affect the habitat of the birds. So what are we doing to reduce the threats of these birds? We talked about what the threats are, but what can we do to protect these birds? So during the summer, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service interns such as me scare away predators off Faulkner Island during the day and at night to protect these common and roseate terns. So a couple years ago, the Forage Fish Conservation Act was introduced, but unfortunately it did not pass. But what this would have done would have been prohibiting the development of any new forage fish fisheries. However, the bill was then reintroduced this year by the Senate and was supported by a variety of organizations such as the Audubon Society. Still has not passed yet, but it's still in the works of getting passed this year, if not next year. So we talked about what we are all doing, but what can you personally do as an individual to protect these birds from all the threats that we just talked about? So be aware when you're out fishing. There are areas where you're not allowed to fish, which is then in order to protect these various types of birds. When you're out on the water or you're going towards the water, learn about the birds that live in your area and in your state. There are guidebooks that you can purchase online, such as Amazon, to learn about these types of birds. You could donate money and also volunteer your time to a local seabird conservation organization, such as the Audubon Society. Connecticut has their very own Audubon Society that's located throughout the state that you can join and participate in various activities to help protect these birds. So before I started this internship, I did a few activities with the Audubon Society to learn more about what we can do to protect these birds. Also, you can call your local senator to voice your opinion about what we can do to protect these birds. So just like I was talking about in the previous slide, where we didn't pass that Organization Act. If we call our senators now, we can also try to get that bill passed in order to protect these birds. Also, you can stay at least 1,000 feet away from nesting colonies. The further away we stay away from these nesting colonies, the more we don't have to worry about these nesting colonies failing, and also to protect the birds and also protect the birds during their incubation period and also the chicks. So what should you not do? Before we were talking about what you should do, but now what you should not do. You should not feed the birds. You should not chum water when seabirds are around. And so what chumming is like throwing your bait and fish parts, bone, blood into the water. That can affect the food for these birds. And then lastly, don't leave your fishing poles unattended. As we saw in the images in the previous slides, if you leave your fishing pole unattended, it could also lead to the fishing hooks coming off and you don't realize it's happening, which could then harm, if not kill, the birds. So here's just an image of a sign you could potentially see off of a dock that says no fishing. If there's a sign that says no fishing, it's probably for a specific reason. And lots of times those reasons are to protect the birds that are within that area. So that concludes my presentation. So my last slide is just if you have any questions for me that I did not answer before, or if you have any concerns about anything. So if you have any questions now, you can unmute yourself and ask that question, and I'll try to answer it with the best of my abilities.
Two questions, Adam. This is Carl Harvey, Menonkatuk Audubon. One, have you gone back and looked at the data that was collected by Jeff Spendelow and earlier by Sally Richards and the Turn Project to see how the results we're finding this year compare with earlier years?
So we have been comparing. Results that we've seen in the previous years. So while we're on the island, we have to look at previous data to see what the production rate is like for these other birds. And so what we have noticed is that these birds throughout the years have been doing pretty well. We did see a drop this year, which are mostly because of a lot of different reasons. This hasn't happened in a long time. But throughout the years on Faulkner Island, we've seen high production rates of these common and roseate terns.
Second question is the impact, it's a pollution impact, and that would be plastics and microplastics.
Yep. So what's your specific question about the plastics?
In terms of, what impacts perhaps microplastics would be having on the food sources for the birds and the birds ingesting microplastics.
So I did not see, when I was doing my research, I didn't see anything on plastics. So Chris, did you see anything about how microplastics or regular plastics have been having an effect on these birds?
I just wrote in the chat that we have not looked at plastics.
Okay, that's what I thought.
As a refuge. Maybe somebody studying it from a university, but I have not done that research.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Thanks, Chris.
I just wanted to follow up on the Forage Fish Conservation Act.
Mm-hmm.
There's a coalition of Connecticut organizations that's working on gaining support for the Forage Fish Conservation Act. They include Audubon Connecticut, the State Office of National Audubon, Connecticut Audubon Society, the Independent Audubon Society, Menonkatuk, Connecticut Ornithological Association, and the two aquariums in Mystic and Norwalk. And we've been working on this for 3 years. And if you are interested in this, follow any of those organizations on social media, and we'll be keeping you up to date on what's going on with that.
Hi, this is Chris. I just want to put a little note in here that we have been noticing on the island. We've been doing provisioning surveys is, we didn't get to do that this year, but over the past, I think I have 4 or 5 years of data. We've noticed that in some years, the forage fish availability isn't as robust as it should be. So terns are struggling to find the right amount of food. It usually affects common terns more than roseate terns, and we're not sure why. But there are a lot of people that are looking into this. So it would be super important to protect the forage fish that we do have and to try to find out more about their biology, life cycle, that kind of thing, and how that influences the rest of the species, like humpback, from everything from humpback whales to terns. So.
Well, one comment I would like to make about the forage fish, and that specifically relates to sand lances. From Sally Richards was doing a lot of work in her research that she was doing with Yale on sand lances, and all of her data and information and research is now in the library at the Sound School in New Haven. There is limited access now because of COVID, but all of those materials that she had are now located, as I say, in the library at the Sound School. And if you wish to follow up on that, I can talk to Tim Weissel and perhaps get some access to those materials. So for future reference, Chris.
Thank you.
Okay, so any other questions or comments that you would like to make about the presentation?
Very good job, Adam.
Thank you very much. And I really appreciate everybody coming in to hear about my talk about the threats and what we can do about the threats for the seabirds throughout the world and also in Connecticut. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming in for my talk. If you have any specific questions more about Faulkner Islands, as you can see in my last slide, I linked Chris Vago's email address into this. So if you have any questions, you can email her. So she can get back to you as soon as possible about any of those questions.
Everyone.
Thank you.
All right, thank you everybody for coming.
Next week, we've got 2 more programs on Monday and Thursday. Monday is about why birds nest colonially, and on Thursday, sand lance. So check our websites and social media to register for those programs.